Anyway, good morning. This is Tom Lombardo, Center for Future Consciousness, and this is a presentation workshop webinar on the evolution of science fiction. And this is a continuation of Module 9, which I began 2 weeks ago, but we didn't have enough time to finish it. And so I thought we would finish it up today with more discussion than usual and do a little review of both last time and what's to come in the future. Module 9 is on the early 20th century. And I subtitled the module Disturbing the Peace, because in the first few first few decades of the 20th century, there was an awful lot of invention, transformation, anxiety, turmoil, activity, tumultuous change going on in the world. And up here, there's a number of images of various dimensions of change, political, artistic, entertainment, that were occurring during that time. And people often will ask the question, how well does science fiction predict the future? Or how does science fiction anticipate or influence the future? And one key thing to think about this era is that science fiction also reflected what was going on during that period, during those decades. And in fact, that will be a place to start up the discussion today, which is with how the tumultuous early part of the 20th century and things going on actually had an impact on what was written in science fiction. Up here, I have a number of images of different authors and different important books, and also a couple movie images as well, because science fiction in the first few decades of the 20th century becomes cinematic, becomes multimedia. And I already had talked about Méliès, and today we'll be talking about other silent movies that were created in the decades afterwards, leading up to Metropolis. So just to go back to where we were at the end of the last webinar, the early 20th century dystopias, the virtues and failings of order. Aside from the question of how well does science fiction predict the future, another question I often hear is, why are there so many dystopian images in science fiction? How did that happen? Where did that come from? Why? And early in the 20th century, and I've already talked a bit about these already, there were a number of very important dystopias that were written. And if one were to ask, well, when did dystopias really become a popular theme in the genre of science fiction, you would have to say early on in the 20th century. And if you recall, H.G. Wells had started writing various dystopias and utopias too, back around the same time. Now, why did these authors and other ones write these dystopias like The Iron Heel and The Messiah of the Cylinder and City of Endless Night? And one reason for this increased proliferation of dystopias was that these authors and other authors saw things in contemporary society that they believed were significant failings or weaknesses of modern civilization, and wanted to highlight those weaknesses and critique them in the form of an imagined dystopia that would present to you, if this goes on, if we keep behaving and thinking this way, this is where it's going to lead to something dark and bleak. The Iron Heel by Jack London was basically a critique of modern Western capitalism. Modern Western capitalism controlled by the super rich elite. And it's a bleak vision of the future in which we have a tyrannical or dictatorial society ruled by the super rich, and capitalism is the fundamental philosophical tyrant that controls people. And of course, people keep bringing that issue up even up to the present day. But London saw capitalism and the rule of the rich as being the weakness or failing of Western civilization. Rousseau, in The Messiah of the Cylinder, who was strongly influenced by H.G. Wells, at the same time saw Wells' message of a scientifically based future utopia as the problem, that contemporary society is becoming more and more ruled by science, and religion is losing its hold. And so Rousseau envisions a 21st century in which Christianity has been outlawed and society is ruled by science and reason. That was his dystopia, that we don't want to get rid of religion. We get rid of religion, we get rid of Christianity, we lose our heart. We lose the emotional core of our existence, and science will rob us of that. So science becomes the enemy, becomes the focus of the dystopia in Rousseau's The Messiah of the Cylinder. And in fact, the end of it, Christianity reasserts itself in the 21st century as a significant power in the West. City of Endless Night, which is, I think, the most inventive of these three novels, which was written in 1920, basically, in a lot of ways, foresaw the rise of German fascism or Nazism. Hastings, who wrote it, and having traveled to Germany and observed Germany after World War I, anticipated a rise of a self-proclaimed super race, the Germans, who would attempt to conquer the world, and envisions a world in which Berlin has become a fortified dome city of 300 million people and is eugenically controlled to facilitate the evolution of this super race. In fact, just to give you a feel for how dramatically and effectively Hastings envisioned this dark future world, based on what he saw in Germany in the late 19 teens, right after World War I. Here's a quote from it. "We are the youth of the super race. It is our duty to learn while we are yet young all that we may ever need to know, to keep our minds free from forbidden knowledge, and to resist the temptation to think of unnecessary things. Of all the people of the earth, our race alone possessed the two keys to power: the mastery of science, the German intellect, and the mastery of the sword, the German warrior. So the Germans were called of God to instill fear and reverence into the hearts of inferior races." That's an oath that the German youth in the City of Endless Nights have to recite and dedicate themselves to. So what Hastings saw was he saw the threat of eugenics, of attempting to manipulate humanity to create a super race, and he saw the threat of Germany attempting to control the world. So these dystopias all are looking at contemporary problems and projecting out and saying, hey, we better not go that direction because look where we're going to end up. And We, which I also discussed last time, was written right on the heels of the communist revolution in Russia, And Zamyatin's book is the first book that the Soviet Union officially censored. And the paradox in We is that although you could see it as a critique of communalism, of the we being supreme and the I being insignificant and evil, of the idealization of the well-ordered machine, both socially and one's mind like a machine. The ending of it is rather ambiguous. So it's one of the great dystopias written during the time as a reaction to the rise of communism, but in the end, it is rather ambiguous about whether this indeed is a dystopia or isn't a dystopia. But again, we see contemporary reality triggering off the writing of a science fiction dystopian novel that is used as a critique of contemporary times, or a trend in contemporary times. And the most famous of all of the dystopias written during this period was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And Brave New World was a critique, on one hand, of H.G. Wells and his utopian visions, such as A Modern Utopia and Men Like Gods, but it was also a critique or a satire on various trends he saw in contemporary Western human society. For example, mass production, and in this case here, humans become mass produced. And it's also a critique of the bread and circuses and shallowness he saw in Western civilization and culture, in which people don't want to read anymore and just want to stimulate themselves with various drugs, in particular soma, and engage in the purchasing of various trivial games that they amuse themselves with. And Huxley was not only just critiquing Wells, he was critiquing what he saw as trends in our culture, and he wrote as a postscript 20, 30 years later from Brave New World that perhaps there was a third choice between the savage who wanted to read books, who hated the world that he saw, this modern world, and the leader of the North American section of this modern world, who argued that either you could have freedom or you could have happiness. And don't choose freedom because it isn't going to bring you happiness. And Huxley was wondering later on in his life whether there might have been a third choice besides the person who wanted freedom but was embracing misery along with it, or the one who said, let's get rid of misery, but in the end, we're not going to have anything like self-initiative, and we're going to be reduced to individuals who simply stimulate their pleasure centers and never want to read any books. And Brave New World in a lot of ways was very prescient too, very predictive of where we are today. And so on one hand, you could say that it reflected contemporary society. It was a critique on contemporary society. It was a critique on Wells, but it also anticipated certain aspects of the modern world that we see around us. Now, those are the famous dystopias that developed, were written during this 25-year period, reflecting the modern world, critiques of the modern world. Now, I'm going to also throw in now, and this is where we move forward into something unique, I'm going to throw in one other novel written that, even though it was a utopia, at the same time, it was also a critique of contemporary Western civilization. And it identified as the central flaw or failing of Western civilization, male dominance. That was our problem. And the novel was Pearlium by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, written and published in 1915. And Pearlium is a story about three male characters who become aware that there may be somewhere in the wilderness a society entirely made of women with no men. And these three male characters decide to find this society. And they do. And the three male characters represent three different male points of view regarding men and women. One character treats women and thinks of women as weaker humans who need to be protected and pampered and adored. One individual sees women as objects of sexual conquest, to be dominated and controlled. And the third character sees women as equal, as human beings at the same level status as males. And the story involves how these three male characters, taken into this society entirely made up out of women, react to this strange and different society. And it both is a critique of certain aspects of the male mindset, which Gilman, based upon how she was treated as a woman, having been put at one point in her life in a home for nervous disorders for women because she couldn't adapt successfully to being a wife. And it's also a vision of what would be a better human society than the kind of society we are presently in. Now, there's a lot of different things to say about Herland. For example, that it's philosophically very sophisticated, presents very good arguments, that it is a classic in early feminist literature. But another thing to say about it, and here is where she resonated actually with Wells. The key to a better future is not through gadgetry and more technology. The key is through the purposeful education and evolution of the human mind. The citizens of Herland are vastly superior along multiple psychological and physical dimensions than the three male visitors. They're healthier, they're stronger, they're more mentally at peace, they're more intelligent, and that's because the whole society revolves around the thoughtful nurturance of its offspring. They have a goddess religion that identifies motherhood as the spark of the divine within humanity, and they intentionally focus their efforts on producing better and better human beings with each generation. Not better and better gadgets, better and better human beings. And so just like Wells thought the solution wasn't going to be that we evolve our machinery more, although Wells is very pro-science, Wells' main emphasis was how do we evolve ourselves more, psychologically, socially, ethically. And that's the position that Gilman takes. So the thing to keep in mind, even though this is a utopia, it's presented both as a critique of what's wrong with our present world and a proposal for how to make it better. And so it belongs within the same set of novels that I've already talked about that present different kinds of critiques of contemporary times and envision a different or better future that could possibly be if we were to get rid of whatever would be the problem that we had with our contemporary world. So why were there so many dystopias being written? Part of it is simply that there were a lot of different flaws and failings that people observed in contemporary society that deserved narrative critiques. And there were various views during that time regarding what would make for a better world, whether it was science or capitalism or masculine control or order above individuality. These were the problems. And so how do we get rid of that, and how do we move to something better? We'll come back to that again, but the theme there is that science fiction in part doesn't simply just try to predict, it also tries to influence, and say, this is what we're doing wrong, and this is what we should do to make it better. Now we're going to go in an entirely different kind of direction at one level with the evolution of science fiction. But we're going to notice a connection at the same time from what I just talked about. Hugo Gernsback, originally Hugo Gernsbacker, from Luxembourg, born in the latter part of the 19th century, immigrated to the United States in 1903, 1904. A statement about Gernsback. Gernsback's genius was in identifying a purpose in science fiction as a means of creating tomorrow. Gernsback brought science to the general public, and he sold to those people a vision that the creation of tomorrow was in their own hands. They could build the future. And that's from Mike Ashley, who wrote an extensive a study of Gernsback, which I will come to in a little bit. But a question that futurists often ask: how can my work have an impact on the ongoing evolution of human society? And Gernsback, his central focus was to generate such an impact on the future of humanity, and he did so through science fiction. And now I'll explain how. When Gernsback came to the United States, he was a believer that the United States was a land of opportunity. Gernsback was an entrepreneur and a businessman who had a love for technology, in particular radio and electronics. And when he got over here in the early part of the 20th century, he started a mail order catalog, which eventually developed into a magazine called Modern Electrics. And Gernsback was into making money and into spreading the gospel of the wonders of modern science and technology. And in doing that, not only did he have articles about ongoing developments in the radio and in electronics, but he also would include at times stories about the future of science and technology. Gernsback had been an avid reader of Wells and of Verne and of Edisonade, late 19th century Frank Reed stuff. And in 1911, he wrote a serial called Ralph 124C41 Plus. It was a novel in serial form that came out in Modern Electrics. And what he attempted to do in that serial was to present a whole set of predictions about the future of technology and science in the 27th century. And he explicitly said that these are very plausible, possible predictions. And in that sense, he was writing a science fiction novel, if one is to conceive of science fiction as an attempt to predict the future of science and technology. And the novel became infamous in science fiction because it is incredibly wooden and poorly written, with very little plot. And at the same time, there are hundreds of technological predictions, a huge percentage of them actually having come through or true since. Now, this is in the early part of the 20th century. So we have an entrepreneur, businessman who believes in science and technology, starts a magazine called Modern Electrics, writes a novel about the future of science and technology. And by the way, if you look at the title of Ralph, it is Ralph 124C for the many. Gernsback was a self-proclaimed visionary. Ralph was his alter ego, predicting the future. There's Gernsback with an interesting contraption on his head, on his face, and I'm not even sure what the hell that thing did. But Gernsback was always messing around with technology. And in fact, after modern electrics, it evolved into the electrical experimenter. And in the electrical experimenter, which comes about 5 years later, he actually predicts the television and the telephone, which is a telephone with video. And Gernsback continued to publish in the electrical experimenter various narratives that people would write about the future of science and technology, and not just simply articles on science, technology, and electronics. And within another 10 years, the electrical experimenter had evolved into an even broader scoped magazine called Science and Invention. And I'm not sure if you can see up on the screen the magazine cover images on the right side, as I see your faces over there, but you'll see one image of a man floating upside down with a space helmet on out in outer space. And the title of the story is The Man from the Atom. I don't know if you could see that or not. If you can't, we'll come back and look at it again. And that was a science fiction story that was submitted to Gernsback, which he accepted in a issue of a Science and Invention that contained simply science fiction stories. Now, if you look at the bottom of the magazine, you'll see that it's called scientific fiction. Gernsback also would use the expression scientific fiction to refer to the kinds of stories that he was publishing. But he had this idea by the 1920s that perhaps we could have a magazine devoted simply to scientific fiction or scientific fiction stories. And he played around with it for a couple years. And eventually, in 1926, he published the first issue of Amazing Stories, which is the first magazine devoted exclusively to scientific fiction stories. Notice on the cover where you see the planet Saturn with the yellow sky, there are a bunch of characters apparently ice skating on a frozen lake, and in the background are two ships up on mountaintops, and behind that is an image of Saturn with a yellow sky. That's the cover of the first issue of Amazing Stories. Gernsback, in that particular issue, published almost entirely reprints of stories that had been written before 1926. And the opening story in that first issue was Jules Verne's Off on a Comet. And that image is actually an accurate reproduction, vision, of a scene in Verne's Off on a Comet. And it was painted by Frank Paul, who became Gernsback's primary artist, and I'll come more to Frank Paul in a little bit, but Paul did all of the Amazing Stories covers for Gernsback for 3 or 4 years. And in fact, in the background, you can see a couple more of Paul's artistic creations. You could also see Paul's version of the War of the Worlds, and you could also see Paul's version of the Skylark of Space when it came out in 1928. Well, Amazing Stories, its first issue, sold 100,000 copies. This is back in 1926. And Gernsback was off to the races, an incredible success story for 3 or 4 years, from 26 to 29. And little by little, he began to publish more stories by new writers as opposed to just reprinting stories by Wells and Verne. But he was very inventive and he was an entrepreneur. So he would have contests, among other things. Like Paul painted this cover for Amazing Stories in 1926. And look at the cover. And Gernsback offered $500 to the writer who could come up with the most interesting or fascinating story based on that cover. Gernsback very quickly encouraged his readers to write in and make comments about science, technology, science fiction, and the future of science and technology. And Gernsback believed that the advances, ongoing advances of science and technology were incredible, were wonderful, and that it was leading to an amazing, much better world in the future. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to popularize that vision of the future and popularize it through science fiction. But Gernsback had a problem, and the problem he had was that he frequently would pay himself big amounts of money as a salary. In fact, he earned more money when he was the editor of Amazing Stories than the President of the United States was earning at that time. And he would be very stingy and reticent in paying his writers. And he eventually got sued, and he lost control of Amazing Stories. And within a few months, he started to publish a new magazine. There's a picture of Richard Paul, by the way. He started publishing a new magazine called Science Wonder Stories. And he also started publishing at the same time Ear Wonder Stories. This is 1929. And he believed that the expression science fiction was proprietary, that it connected with Amazing Stories, and he didn't own Amazing Stories any longer. He lost it. So he had to come up with another expression that he felt he wouldn't get sued on for the genre, the literary genre that he was supporting. And in the October issue of Science Wonder Stories, and it's down there on the bottom, for the first time on the cover of a magazine, you see the expression science fiction, which was Gernsback's invention that was a way to get around not getting sued for using or continuing to use the expression science fiction. And so that's how the expression science fiction came into popularity. And it only came into popularity because Gernsback was a skinflint, a cheat, who got sued for not paying his writers money, and then he had to come up with a new name for the genre. So in the late 20s, 4 years, Amazing Stories, and the early 1930s, Science Wonder Stories. And this is where science fiction in magazine form really takes off. And it takes off with Gernsback, with the publication of these two magazines, and a whole slew of new writers starting to come on the scene. Now, I just want to summarize and highlight some things about Gernsback. Some of them I talked about already, but to see the importance of him in the history of science fiction. He was an entrepreneur who embraced America as the land of opportunity, and he believed in science and the philosophy of enlightenment. And he was a dynamo. He had multiple projects going. He had radio stations, he had magazines. He even had a magazine on sex besides science fiction. And he was out to make money, and he was out to promote the value of science and technology. When asked what the function of science fiction was, he highlighted four things: to educate, to predict, to inspire, and to entertain. And in fact, on the inspire part, he believed that he could stimulate prospective inventors through his stories into creating the very gadgetries that were in his stories that he was publishing. That is, he wanted to inspire the ongoing evolution of technology through his stories. He wanted to predict too, but he realized he had to entertain, but he also wanted to educate. And he talked both about science and technology as well as science fiction. And he was the first person who actually stopped and reflected on the heritage, the history of science fiction, and wrote the first primitive histories of the genre. That is, he not only gave it a name, he made it self-conscious and self-reflective. And in the magazines, he laid out what the history, according to Gernsback, was of this new genre. And of course, he popularized the name science fiction. And not only did he encourage discussions of science and technology, but he appreciated the value of art as a way to dramatically present the ideas of science fiction. And Frank Paul was his most significant discovery in that regard. And he created a public forum for the fans. That is, early on, he had a section in the magazines, both in Amazing Stories and in Wonder Stories, for fans to write in letters and discuss and evaluate the stories that were in the magazine. By 1934, he had created the Science Fiction League, which was a group you could belong to by sending in money and applying for membership. And of course, Gernsback would get the money, but it was intended to have an international outreach. And the idea was that the fans that he was stimulating and gathering together would speak the gospel of science fiction and convert others to the cause. He eventually became the figure who the World Science Fiction Convention decided to name its annual awards after. So the Hugo Award is from Hugo Gernsback. But at the same time, one of his most famous writers, who he once paid very slowly, if at all, $25 for one of the great science fiction stories of the period, The Color Out of Space. $25 to H.P. Lovecraft for that story. Lovecraft referred to Gernsback as Hugo the Rat, because Gernsback wouldn't pay his writers, including Lovecraft. So the moral in this for futurists to think about, to contemplate, is look at this character and the way he thought and behaved and how he initiated, created, and fueled a social movement of tens of thousands of people across the globe enthused with a message and a philosophy of how to come at the future. He created, more than anybody else, the science fiction community and science fiction fandom, and a way to think about the future. Think about it in terms of exciting, entertaining, educational narratives. Jump on the bandwagon. And so Gernsback is very significant in thinking about how people influence the future, how they create futurist movements, and the character here, he's a very fascinating character. And on the right there, there's a book that I have up there, The Gernsback Years, which chronicles Gernsback's development through about a 20-year period there between the 1920s and toward the end of the 1930s. Okay, so while Gernsback is doing this with amazing stories and wonder stories, he had been encouraging and supporting the work of science fiction's first great artist of the 20th century, Frank Paul. And Frank Paul was a very colorful and, as you could see, very imaginative artist who created very fascinating and vivid depictions of alien worlds and aliens. And Paul excelled at that. He also did very well with imagining future technologies, but I think that the key thing he did was that his artwork on aliens and alien worlds is just fantastical. And Paul is recognized as the father of modern science fiction art. And Gernsback encouraged him, supported him, employed him, and used him for 25 years. So although Gernsback might have been rather dry and didactic and thinking that science fiction is here to educate, he realized the importance of the visionary or visual dimension of science fiction. Clearly, he saw it through the work of Paul. Now, while Gernsback was publishing his amazing and wonder stories, there was another magazine that was coming to the fore then too. Oh, excuse me, I have another, oh no, I flipped it around. Excuse me, let me stop for a second. I actually jumped ahead of myself. Okay. What I was gonna talk about first, I was gonna talk about some of the stories and amazing stories before moving on to my next point. Yeah, okay. By the way, what time do we have, Terry?
It is almost at the hour.
Almost at the hour. Okay,
yeah.
All right. About 5 minutes, we'll take a break.
Okay.
I just wanted to highlight some of the interesting stories quickly that appeared in the late 1920s with Gernsback and Amazing Stories. Every year, Gernsback would publish the best of amazing stories, an anthology, and looking at the series of anthologies that he published and reading the stories in them, I've come up for you with the best of amazing stories, in my opinion. And here's a quote from one of them. And it's by George Allen England, who next to Edgar Rice Burroughs was the most popular writer of science, fantasy, and fiction in the first couple decades of the 20th century. And the quote is, the depths of space, stars sprinkled, hung above them, vastness immeasurable, cold beyond all understanding of the human mind. And from shadows past the boundaries of the universe seem to beckon things that God grant can never come to man to be known to the end of the earth. And that's from England's The Thing from Outside, which is a very fascinating, mysterious, spooky story written about a bunch of characters lost in the Canadian wilderness with something following them that never takes definite shape. And that was one of the most famous stories that came out early in the history of amazing stories. But when Gernsback was publishing Science and Invention, he received in 1923 a submission, a story called The Man from the Atom by G. Peyton Wertenbaker that was published in 1923 in Science and Invention and then republished in Amazing Stories in the first issue. And Gernsback bought the story. And after he bought the story, he found out that the author of The Man from the Atom was 16 years old. And there's an image of Wertenbaker a little bit later. He's obviously more than 16 years old. But The Man from the Atom was one of the most popular early stories that was published in Amazing Stories. And it was another one of those stories about moving through different levels of size. In this case, not shrinking in size, but expanding in size. And it was very moving for a 16-year-old to write such a story. But later that same year, in 1926, Wertenbaker submitted The Coming of the Ice, which also got published in Amazing Stories and was voted as the best science fiction story of 1926. And it's about a man who discovers the secret of immortality. But in order to become immortal, he has to give up sex and love and romance. He has to become a cerebral being, and he lives to the end and the extinction of humanity. And it's a very fascinating tale in what the value of immortality may be in the big context of what you have to give up to gain it. And this is written, he's 16, 17 years old. The first story that has a scientific explanation of zombies, The Plague of the Living Dead, by A.E. Verrill, who was a biologist and explorer, wrote over 100 books, 25 stories and Amazing Stories, about a man who discovers a drug that when you inject it into a dead animal or a human, they come back to life. And even if you inject it into a part of an animal or a human that's dead, it comes back to life. And it's a hilarious tale that was written back in 1927, 1928. And it seems to be the first a scientifically grounded theory or a narrative on zombies. And I only mention one more here, A Baby on Neptune, which was written by one of the earliest noted women science fiction writers in the magazines, Claire Harris Wigner. And it's a story about the relativity of perception, where we receive signals from Neptune and we go there, we don't see anything at all because we're viewing things in a different temporal speed than the beings on Neptune exist within. And Harris was going to be one of the first significant female science fiction writers to emerge in the magazines. And notice, there is no photo of her. The best you can come by on Google is a drawing of her. So that's just a little highlights of some of the first stories that came up with in Gernsback's Amazing Stories and some of the significant writers that emerged during that time too. Now that's probably a good spot. Oh yeah, let me just do one last slide, then we'll take a break. Okay, this is where I thought the next slide was. At the same time Gernsback was publishing Amazing and Wonder Stories, another magazine started up in 1923 was publishing some science fiction, but was publishing a lot of spooky and supernatural stuff as well. But a lot of science fiction emerged in it during that same time. And that magazine was Weird Tales. Now, this image we have here is painted by Virgil Finlay, who would become one of the great science fiction artists of the mid-20th century. And it was painted for Weird Tales. And it's got various horned devil-like beings in it, and it's got this beautiful babe right in the middle. And one of the things about Weird Tales, in order to be commercial, is that their covers often had these very half-naked, if not totally naked women coupled together with various monsters. And in these magazines, we find H.P. Lovecraft, and we find Edmund Hamilton, and we find lots of other science fiction or horror science fiction writers also beginning to publish in here too. But it had a lot of supernatural stuff in it as well. So it wasn't exclusively science fiction, but it did compete to some degree with Amazing Stories and Wonder Stories during the 1920s and into the 1930s. So by the 1920s, science fiction magazines and science fiction horror magazines are really taken off, and they're definitely into a lot of visualization, and a lot of new artists are appearing. And the ongoing visualization, the multi-sensory experience of science fiction, and mixing it together with horror and Weird Tales as well. And how that encouraged a whole slew of really great artists to emerge during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. By the way, just one last thing about Gernsback. I was just thinking this when I just took a break for a second. When you read the science fiction biography of him, the Gernsback days, in spite of all of his character flaws, you got to admire him in the end. He is a very inspiring and fascinating character who did an awful lot to influence and grow science fiction as a national and then global reality and a community to go with it. So he was a man who had a lot of mental energy and liked to strut around in fancy suits, and he lived on Park Avenue, if I recall correctly. But he did a lot. And he discovered the first wave of American science fiction writers. So while we got visualization going on in science fiction art, we have another dimension of visualization that begins to emerge in science fiction in the comics. And in Gernsback's Amazing Stories in 1928, he published a story about a character who was named Anthony Rogers. And the writer of the story was approached by a newspaper to perhaps turn Anthony Rogers into a comic strip. And out of that, in 1929, emerged the comic strip Buck Rogers. And Buck Rogers was the first significant a science fiction comic. And he's sort of like, in a way, the beginning of the superhero dimension of science fiction that we see definitely in the comics. And here's, in fact, a couple reproductions of strips, comic strips from that early period, Buck Rogers, 2429 AD. And Buck Rogers would eventually develop into the movies and into radio and diversified out, but also it ended up getting commercialized so that you could buy Buck Rogers ray guns, Buck Rogers characters, Buck Rogers spaceships. It was the beginning of the commercialization of science fiction. And science fiction has turned in contemporary times into an incredible commercial enterprise with Star Wars and Star Trek and umpteen science fiction characters and contraptions you can go buy in toy stores. And of course, there's the whole video game dimension too. This is another way in which science fiction would have a big impact on popular culture, and the visions created of the future in science fiction would have a big impact on popular culture. If you want to impact the human mind, find ways to sell it, and sell it so that the packages that you're selling are attractive and interesting. And in fact, sell it to the kids in particular, raise them on it. So when we talk about, say, for example, how you introduce futures thinking into elementary education or secondary education, it gets introduced there in pop culture through science fiction. And this goes back to Buck Rogers. And then after Buck Rogers, 4 or 5 years later, we get Flash Gordon. And the array of products that begins to emerge in science fiction with these two superheroes, which little kids, especially boys, identify with, is another lesson for futurists and for somebody who wants to influence the future. You got to find ways to package and sell it. And Buck Rogers led the way on that. Now, as I mentioned, Buck Rogers and then also Flash Gordon, both of them did turn into movies in the coming decade, talkies. But before we get to the talkies, I want to talk about the last period of science fiction cinema when science fiction cinema was still silent, no sound. And up here, we have an image from Woman in the Moon. And I have up some images of different well-known silent science fiction movies in the period, beginning with the first Frankenstein done by the Edison studio, which you can watch the whole thing. It's not very long. It's up on YouTube. And it's a Hollywood distortion of the story. It's got some special effects in it, but Méliès special effects were much better than the special effects that Edison put together for this movie. And as I said, it's a Hollywood distortion because in the end, Frankenstein and his wife live happily ever after, which is not how the novel ends at all. And also up there, there's an image of the Lost World where we get the evolution of claymation dinosaurs with O'Brien, who went on 5 years later, 5 years later to do King Kong. And we also have up there an image of the Danish movie, Himmelskibet, which translates in English as the sky ship or ship to the heaven. This came out in 1918, right at the tail end of World War I. And this one you could also watch the entirety of on YouTube. And this is a fairly good movie, all things considered, because it's a story about the human impulse of adventure and exploration and the conflict between the innovative mind and the conservative mind, and ending up with a ship going to the planet Mars, where Martians are met and there's a connection made between advanced Martians. It's a kind of utopian vision of Mars, for sure, and the humans who go along on the trip and go up to Mars. The other image I have up there, which aligns with the background image, is Frauenmund by Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo. And that's the image that we have up on the back too, where we see a woman with a camera that is standing on a lunar landscape, and Woman in the Moon, and the quote I have up there, "Never does not exist in the human mind, only not yet," was the best, by far, outer space science fiction movie produced up till 1950. It came out in 1929, both as a novel and as a movie, and as a collaboration between a husband and wife team, Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo. And Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo are best known for Metropolis, which actually was made a couple years earlier. But I want to first talk about Woman in the Moon for some important features of it. And you can watch this on YouTube. Did I say that already? Because I've watched the whole thing on YouTube. I don't have a copy of it. I know I must have watched it on YouTube. And it's silent, but it's a very moving and very effective movie visually, showing how science fiction is beginning to evolve as a sophisticated visual medium. But before I come to it, I want to mention another one that was also well known in the 1920s, Aelita, which was actually produced in Russia. And it was produced in 1924, Aelita, Queen of Mars. And this movie was inspired by the Communist Revolution. And a lot of it takes place in Russia in the 1920s as the Communist Revolution is going on. But one scientist who is building a rocket ship seems to be in some kind of psychic connection with the mind of the Queen of Mars. And Aelita is the Queen of Mars, or the goddess of Mars. And the noteworthy thing in this movie is that the scenes and imagery of Martian civilization and the Martians are incredible. They're a combination of Art Deco, futurism design, and they have a kind of streamlined, futuristic looking quality to them. And the character that steals the show in this is right in the center there. The actress who plays Aelita, Queen or Goddess of Mars. Notice the outfits that these Martians have. Notice the outfits that she has. And she is a mesmerizing, psychotic, agitated, crazy character in this movie. She is is erotic and a techno scintillating grasshopper through the whole thing. She's communicating with a person on the Earth through her mind in a machine from this city on Mars, and the character eventually comes to Mars in a rocket ship, a human character, the male, and they lead a revolution on Mars, which produces a communist government on Mars. So this is communist propaganda at the same time. The Martians do not have a good civilization, even though they're technologically advanced. They're a socially unjust civilization. And between Aelita and the character from the Earth, a communist revolution is ignited up there. But you got to watch this just simply to watch her and to look at the scenes and look at the set designs that were put together for the film. And it's significant, and this is where I'll come back in a second to Fritz Lang and Woman in the Moon, is that the central character who grabs your attention and is the hero of the movie is a woman, not a man, a woman, Aelita. And Aelita is literally a kind of Dionysian, that's the right word, Dionysian character. She's not an intellect. She operates with her senses, her emotions, and she leads the revolution from there. So another little theme here that comes up in science fiction and thinking about science fiction and the study of the future is that you got to have a person of passion and color and animation to lead the way into the future. In this case here, we have crazy Aelita. And Aelita definitely comes off as crazed, to say the least, in the movie. So I would definitely recommend watching it if you could sit through the draggy parts of it that take place in 1920 Russia to get to the scenes from Mars. But it's a very significant early silent science fiction movie, one of the best movies made during the silent era. Now, let's go back to Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo. They were only married about 10, 12 years. And here's an image of the two of them sitting in their study, Fritz Lang sprawled out and Thea sitting up, both of them looking at books. And they formed this incredible husband and wife team for the period that they were together. She was a writer and he was a science fiction fan and a great film producer. He had an incredible career, both while he was with Thea von Harbo, as well as later on after they got divorced. Thea von Harbo, on the other hand, was a superb writer. And both science fiction movies that they produced in the 20s, von Harbo wrote an accompanying novel. She wrote the novel for Woman in the Moon, and she wrote the novel for Metropolis. And again, in both cases, the central character and hero is a woman, not a man. And as I showed you that first shot, here is a bunch of other images from Woman in the Moon. And there is our central heroine who steals the show, I feel, in this movie. This is the first movie made, according to movie historians, that had in it a rocket launch countdown, the rocket taking off from the Earth. It also had a multi-staged rocket in it, first time, and it created this set of very eerie, realistic scenes of the landscape of the moon, because the ship goes to the moon with a set of characters on it. One scientific implausibility in the movie is that the moon has air to breathe. So notice they're walking around there with no oxygen supplying devices on, no spacesuits. They're not cold and they're not suffering from oxygen depletion. But the scenes are really, really good. And she emerges as the hero of the movie, because when they finally get to the moon, due to various misfortunes, they all can't go back on the ship. And there's a love story in this, and she does something very heroic, courageous, to bring the movie to a very upbeat and happy conclusion. She is portrayed, the central character, as both beautiful, loving, and highly intelligent. She's definitely not some dumb babe traveling through space being rescued by the males. She's the one with the brains and the practical brains by the time the movie is over. And I would definitely recommend watching Woman in the Moon. It's, as I said, nobody did anything that was as visually powerful of traveling into outer space and landing on an alien object as Lang and von Harbo did in Woman in the Moon. But 3 years earlier, they had created what is usually considered their masterpiece, and that's what I'm going to end with. And I have an opening quote. This, in fact, is the opening line of the novel. Now the rumbling of the great organ swelled to a roar, pressing like a rising giant against the vaulted ceiling to burst through it. And that sort of sums up the whole plot of the movie and the novel. When the movie was produced in 1926, it was the most expensive movie ever made. And originally, it was over 150 minutes long. And simultaneous with it, the novel came out. It is usually considered to be the greatest silent science fiction movie ever made. I'm sure lots of you have seen it, perhaps seen it more than once, but I would recommend that if you haven't, you should read the novel too, because the novel actually adds to the richness and detail and energy of the movie, written by von Harbo. Von Harbo was a Dionysian, romantic, sensory kind of writer. Just like the movie revels in energy and human passion and human energy, excuse me, I said energy already, and light shows, and it is not a ponderous, philosophical, didactic kind of experience. It is a multi-sensory experience, both the movie and the book. And just to give you a sample of the nature of the text of the novel, here's just one short little paragraph. Metropolis, a restless roaring sea with a surf of light, in the flashes and waves, the Niagara Falls of light, in the color play of revolving towers of light and brilliance, Metropolis seemed to have become transparent. The houses dissected into cones and cubes by the moving sights of the searchlights gleamed, towering up, hoveringly, light flowing down their flanks like rain. The streets licked up the shining radiance, themselves shining, and the things gliding upon them, an incessant stream through cones of light before them. That's how von Harbo wrote. And so it's a real trip and experience to read the novel either before or after seeing the movie. Most of you probably seen the movie. So reading the novel, I would definitely recommend. The movie has been the subject of an incredible amount of scholarship. If you go on the web, go look for Metropolis, you're going to find tons and tons of articles, essays, books written about this movie and how significant it was. And you'll also find some smattering of stuff written on the book. But like I said, the book is as good in a lot of ways as the movie is. And in the movie, but it's in the book too, we have one of the most memorable archetypes in science fiction, the robot Futura. In the movie, I don't think they ever give her name, but in the novel, she is Futura. And Futura is created by a mad, jealous scientist who is together with the political leader of the city of Metropolis, this fantastical city that he governs. She becomes an instrument for evil and for destroying the rebellion that is emerging among the working class. The vision of the future in Metropolis is of a rich, educated elite living in the great luminant towers above the city, and a suppressed and poor lower class who operate all the machinery down below that makes Metropolis possible. In that sense, it's clearly the same vision that you find in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. The rich elite up above being served by the downtrodden and poor below. That's also the same image as in Wells' The Sleeper Awakes. And when Futura is transformed from robotic to human looking, she becomes this evil temptress. And we see a picture of her dancing in one of the pleasure halls in Metropolis, tempting the males. Well, that very character also is an angelic, holy woman, played by the same actress, in the movie, preaching to the poor underneath the earth. So this is a movie that involves the archetypal biblical conflict of good versus evil, of an angelic side to a female and an evil side, the evil side associated with a robot. The movie has this incredible amount of religious symbolism and energy in it. The scenes are very dramatic. The action is very dramatic. The characters engage in life and death struggles. The visions of the underworld are dark and gruesome and hideous. It's a cinematic masterpiece in terms of its vibrancy. People will often ask, what makes for a good science fiction movie? And of course, around the same time, a little bit later, we got H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. But even though that has some amount of action in it, it has nowhere near the energy that Metropolis does, or the symbolism that Metropolis had. H.G. Wells, when he went to see Metropolis, said that when it first came out in 1926, Wells said he thought the movie was silly. And the movie did not get a very great reception. They tried to cut it down, and eventually they put it back together. But Metropolis emerged over the decades as the much more famous and influential movie. In fact, lots of times people will rate Metropolis as the greatest silent science fiction movie of any silent movie ever made. So just in case you haven't seen it, it's definitely recommended seeing it. And it's a Dionysian vision of the future. in that it emphasizes the senses. It has lots of religious symbolism, mythic symbolism in it. There's lots of energy in it. It's not an Apollonian vision like Gernsback had of the wonders of technology. In fact, science and technology turn into the instruments by means of which humanity is enslaved, that we lose sense of our heart. And it is a woman who is a religious figure, almost like a second coming, who saves humanity in the end. So it's at the other end of the continuum. And interestingly, to keep in mind, these two, Metropolis and the beginnings of Amazing Stories by Gernsback, both popped into existence almost in the same year, 1925, 1926. So now we'll have a little test. Who can tell me what that's an image of? Who knows?
Donald Trump.
A wild boar.
Oh, well, Donald Trump, right, Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
Looks
That
just
is-
like him.
Huh?
Looks just like him.
Okay.
It's the house on the borderlands.
Yes, you got it. Okay, Tim, that was Tim, the house on the borderland. Yes. And we talked before about the house on the borderland in the last webinar. This is a very dramatic example of the power of visualization. And those are the swine creatures from the house on the borderland, one of them hovering over gigantic, the house. And just sort of reinforce a bit again how science fiction visualization is such an important dimension to science fiction. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And interestingly, someone said Donald Trump, but the spookiness and power of that novel definitely gets conveyed through that image. But let me just do a little quick review. And I already started mentioning one thing right now, which is that Metropolis versus Gernsback. One is Dionysian, romantic, artistic, and Gernsback attempts to highlight what is rational, scientific, and he's a teacher. But Gernsback embraced art as much as he embraced the teaching part and the logical scientific part. And Gernsback also published lots of stories that did not have a great deal of scientific credibility and were often very Dionysian romantic. Like one of the most famous of all, which I mentioned earlier in the last webinar, was Mirrod's The Moon Pool, which is psychedelic and really Dionysian in its imagery. When you compare, oh, I hit it twice. When you compare Metropolis with The Shape of Things to Come, which came out later, in retrospect, Metropolis emerges as the much more popular movie than Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. The Shape of Things to Come is more explicitly didactic. And even though there is some action in it and some energy, Metropolis is much more archetypal and is much more Dionysian. And that grabs the moviegoer. It's crazier than The Shape of Things to Come. The Shape of Things to Come, the novel in particular, is a great work of scholarship, historical scholarship too. It is an amazing piece of intellectual integration. But how well does it sell? And how well did the movie sell? We've seen that science fiction over this 30-year period, the artistic elements of it are in evolution along with the literary elements. As a theme that runs through the whole 30 years, a fundamental theme here is order and chaos, of hope versus fear, of utopia versus dystopia, of war and disaster versus peace. That is, the tension within the human condition between wanting a better world, a more orderly world, a less disruptive and disastrous reality, and the fear of that coming to pass, on the other hand, exists through this whole 30-year period. And one could, I think, seriously ask yourself, how much has the fundamental theme of the human condition the global human condition actually changed in the last 100 and 150 years. As I presented in my books on future consciousness, the two primal human emotions about the future are hope and fear. And hope and fear define the dialectic, define the tension, define the opposition. The hope of the better world, the more orderly and peaceful world, the more loving world, the more balanced and just world. And the fear of disaster, dictatorships, the crumbling of human civilization. That's been going on for 150, 200 years now. And interestingly, as I mentioned back in the previous webinar, and it still holds true all the way through this, the fact of humans being creative and inventive and generating at least scientific and technological progress, as well as artistic progress, generates both hope and fear in people. That change brings hope, but it also gets people anxious and afraid. Something that science fiction writers talked about through this whole 30-year period, I'm going to continue with it, in spite of the fact that it's often not highlighted sufficiently, is that science fiction writers really get into the issue of human evolution and consciousness. It isn't all just about aliens and gadgets. There's a lot of discussion about what the future evolution of the human mind would be like. I mentioned as one of the best of the period was the Amphibians by C. Fowler Wright, of advanced humans 500,000 years in the future. And also we had during this time the Hamptonshire Wonder, and we're going to see a lot more of that. And Wells thought this was the pathway into a better future, the evolution of the conscious mind, not the evolution of gadgetry. But was also a lot of alien invention. Edgar Rice Burroughs and Abraham Merritt during this 30-year period really produced an amazing assortment of aliens. And the thing to keep in mind with aliens as we go along is aliens are often psychological projections. That is, we project out into the unknown, into outer space, different aspects or features of ourselves, both good and bad, that become psychologically embodied in the alien. And so aliens and alien civilizations, the creations of them, teach us things about our own inner psyche, as well as the possibilities of existence out there. And there's going to be a lot more aliens to come. In fact, in the coming decades, aliens get even more incredibly diversified and colorful than in the previous decades. We still get lots of extraordinary adventures, space adventures, a lot more to come. Now that space has opened up, we have people actually during this period going outside of the solar system, traveling to Alpha Centauri, as well as traveling to Mars and other planets in the solar system. And we get lots of new technology. And just as a final thing about technology is that often in a two-culture mindset, the contrast is made between the artistic and the scientific or scientific technological. But that contrast, that opposition is rather misleading because, in fact, art frequently inspires and stimulates invention. Paul is a great example of this, and Gernsback was a great example of this, in that Gernsback believed, and Paul represented in his art, that if one visualizes and does so in some literary or artistic form, an invention, one can stimulate its creation. The first rocket to get off of the Earth in the US was created by Goddard, stimulated by H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. And so the artistic dimension of humanity and the inventive dimension of humanity are really woven together here, imagination and invention, imagination and technological creation. And that's one of the things that science fiction does very well at, is to stimulate invention and to reinforce the desire to create new technologies or to create new scientific ideas. And we'll see more of that coming as we go along. Okay, so what time we got, Terry?
We have, it's 8 minutes to the hour.
Okay, well then I was gonna have another discussion on H.G. Wells, but I'm not gonna do that. Let me just go on. By the way, in case you want the outlines to these, remember I have the outlines for you. All I wanted to do, just to close out, was to say, next time we get into the greatest superhero of all, faster than a speeding bullet, Superman, who comes on the scene in 1938. In fact, in the next one, next webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the 1930s, because the 1930s was an incredible period for science fiction. We had the first science fiction talkies. We had some of the most amazing science fiction horror ever produced, like The Shadow Out of Time and Who Goes There. We had the greatest writers stylistically to emerge in science fiction up to that point in time. And even though you might be surprised if I say this to you, but one of the greatest writers, skillful writers in science fiction, at least up to at that point in time, was H.P. Lovecraft, along with his buddy in California, Clark Ashton Smith, who will introduce them both. And then we're going to get into space opera and going out into the cosmos with Doc Smith and Edmund Hamilton, and we're going to get into Time Wars, and we're going to get into science fiction becoming plays, and science fiction becoming increasingly satire and comical, like in Karl Čapek's War with the Newts. So the 30s, oh, and science fiction also getting in the radio some more too. So science fiction in the 1930s is an incredible time for invention, creativity, and the expansion of consciousness. And that's what we will do in the next webinar that we